Okay, so I am here with Matt Ehret, and I wanted to reach out because I know that your work overlaps a lot with mine. Um, you do proper journalism. You have written a bunch of books. You do lectures. You actually go to, you know, meetings and give speeches. I've seen some of your lectures, your presentations that you've done, and thanks for coming on. And how about we just start with introducing yourself, the way that you like to think about yourself and your content, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, Terry. No, and thank you for reaching out and sparking this conversation. I've also appreciated your work too. I've seen you on the Hervoge show a few times, and I was always impressed by the insight bombs that you would drop. So yeah, it's a pleasure. I'm sure we're gonna have fun. As you pointed out, I wear a few hats, and one of them is as a writer. So I try to figure, I've been trying to just basically figure out a more truthful story of the relative to the garbage we've all been given to believe is the common narrative, as you have, and I think most people watching this show, if you're watching this program, you're probably in that same boat. I've been doing it for 20 years. I spent about a decade of that 20-year period working with the Schiller Institute that I did from 2006 to 2016, and that was I think it developed a lot of metaphysical muscles, training wise, that I found to be of great use through the studies of the works of Plato, of Saint Augustine, of a lot of the original great minds who did battle with the sophists and the religious engineering or religious engineers of various generations and parts of the world that are always doing the same thing that they're doing today. I mean, it's not like it's new, but it helps when you read the writings of people who have successfully um, provided counter arguments and battled politically, culturally in opposition to this disgusting little perverse ideological framework. And you find that a lot of these great minds are drawing from a similar well of insights that deal with a sense of their own identities, having stemmed from a deep, profound examination of the ontology of their own souls, the health of their soul, and the health of of just humanity in general, and what is required to stop the sickness. Because the oligarchy is sort of they're successful because they've specialized on developing a science to make our souls sick and to make our
Mhm.
minds more inclined to believe in the shadows of sensory perceptions as a substitute for real thinking. That's why people are often very susceptible, I think, to the whole computers will replace us argument that's put out today or these days, because they don't know how to think about how their own healthy creative minds, when operating properly, uh, utilize computer thinking in one way, but transcend computer thinking when operating from a healthy, ironical, metaphorical, playful standpoint. Computers can't do that. But if we are all miswired to be trained to think like computers, then we can't refute the idea that these, you know, thinking machines are going to replace us. So anyway, that was a big thing that I was doing for about a decade with the Schiller Institute, was going through that kind of like heavier and heavier lifting, which I found of use in applying myself to my research in the current day. I run the Canadian Patriot Review, which I set up in 2012 and still going to sort of situate Canada within a broader historic geopolitical sort of context that's often lacking. And my wife and I together, Cynthia, who I know you and she have been in communication too. She might even be on your show at some point soon.
I'd love to talk to her. Yeah.
Cool, yeah. So we've been collaborating for a while. We launched a nonprofit to deal with more of the cultural, educational battles, called it the Rising Tide Foundation, back in 2019, and that's been a fun exercise. We've been doing videos too, so we've increasingly been
Mhm.
flexing the filmmaking muscles with new collaborators that we found over the years who've got skill sets in taking some of our research and turning it into movies. So that's been fun. So yeah, it's look forward to whatever lines you want to take this conversation.
Yeah. I mean, actually, there's so many ways, but I mean, one of the things that stood out to me when I was trying, because I have your books, or at least I have three of them. I have the three
Oh,
mystery, Revenge of the Mystery Cults,
cool.
um, and I'm one of the things that stood out to me is it seemed like you were approaching topics that I've looked into and that I was sort of familiar with, but from an angle that like I wasn't sure where you were going with it, because it seemed like, I'm used to a pretty black and white, Christian. Um, it's just good versus evil, and that's all there is. And there's not a lot of room for nuance with the different sides having competing models of these worldviews and what something like Plato would represent. And I noticed that you were like positive on Plato as almost like a solution to modern problems. And that's where I was, not that I disagree, because I read Plato's Republic, and I thought it was really interesting and very insightful, very powerful, a lot of stuff in there that you could apply. But I get this sense, and from what I've just seen of yours, it seems like you're big on optimism and the ability for us to actually, I mean, in a way, it's
No,
weird.
no, yeah. just the straightforward way you just said it. Like, yeah, I guess that's true.
Yeah, but I mean, that's like a simplistic way of
Yeah,
saying it, but it's like you believe in the potential of humanity to actually, change things, but it's not from sort of the, um, like, let's just go do a big activist march or something. There's like, and I get the sense from your foundation that like you want to talk to people who are maybe in positions to make change, who have been black pilled maybe, or that have this cynical view. Like, where does it come from,
Hmm.
that you like? I mean, optimism is kind of like a trite word for it, but it's like it's not a new agey manifest the great future, by just positive thinking and stuff like that. But do you actually feel like there is, uh, a legitimate discussion happening at any higher level that people could be persuaded? Like, like, how do you feel about the struggle, if there is one,
Yeah.
to steer things in a different direction that actually might be useful?
Yeah, man. No, that's a great question. And it's something that there's so many ways. I'm thinking as I'm hearing you speaking, I'm like, there's so many ways I can maybe respond. So here's the thing that when I'll go through my process maybe, and like, so where did I adopt my philosophy of optimism, right? So it's true, like that is an undercurrent that kind of guides me, is a faith that ultimately humanity was created for some much more beautiful, better destiny than the type of garbage that we're seeing all around us. So I have that. Now, the empirical data would say otherwise. If if
Mhm.
if I were if I were adopting an empiricist attitude of believing what my sensory data would show me, I would have to conclude that is a foolish thing to say, and humanity is clearly not something to put your faith in, right?
Right.
Uh, okay, so the reason why I or the process that I had going from my former more, I guess, negative attitude. I went through a hardcore depression back in 2004, when I was starting to look into, like, at the time I'd encountered some lectures by Mike Rupert, who is now
Mm,
deceased. I don't know if you've probably looked
I
into Mike
remember
Rupert.
him.
Yeah, he was mustache and great guy. I mean, he exposed the whole, like, crack cocaine operated by the CIA infused into,
Right.
ghettos, and he did a great job doing that in the 90s.
He
And
ended up
then
talking about peak oil a lot, didn't he? And then he sort of just
yeah,
yeah.
well, I think he was wrong about the peak oil, because I've now become fully convinced that there's abiogenic oil,
Yeah, me too, but that's the last I remember, and then I think he passed away sometime around 2015 or something, or
something
maybe
like
earlier.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think he was a genuine guy. Like, he was the first person. I was doing BitTorrents, downloading, remember
Mm.
BitTorrents from Pirate Bay and stuff. So that's how I was like, YouTube wasn't so much of a thing, and that's how I was starting to do my research. And what one of his lectures came up, and it was from, it was basically dealing with 9/11, the how the international banks laundered drugs, even control the mafia and drug trade. And I was like, oh, that's actually, I've had those arguments presented to me in the past, but I brushed them off because they were presented in a crazy way
Mm.
by my conspiraphile weed smoking friends who couldn't put into like reason why they were saying those things when I pushed them on it. It came down to shape shifting lizards sucking my fear energy or something. Uh, and so I discarded that entire line of conspiratorial thinking until Mike Rupert was presented to me on my own terms, and I listened to his thing, and I followed his citations and his lines of reasoning, and he cared about my mind enough to take me through his process. So I was like, oh damn, if it's teachable through reason, that means it's something that gives me a power. I could know things well enough that I could also use reason and based on evidence that will
Mm.
help me also communicate. So it's not like something that just disempowers me. And to a certain degree, that was true, but it also disempowered me. So I found myself for like 2 years, doing the bell curve, taking it all in. Before you know it, you're into like, Freemasonic,
Mm.
Inside Out world and Albert Pike, and you're in it, right? And I was starting to realize that I was getting to more theosophical stuff that was bringing me to such conclusions that, like, for example, maybe the oligarchy is right. Maybe
Mm.
they have secret knowledge and know truths that we're too stupid to know, and maybe they need to do these wars. Maybe they need to depopulate us because of secret knowledge that they might have. So I was like, my mind was going there, and I was like, wait, I need to think about a new way of doing this. So I went to a dark spot for a while with no sense of solution, and then it was when you know Cynthia asked me like, what she gives me a hard time sometimes because for her, her like growth period didn't really rely as much on the experience of political organizing as it did for me within the Schiller Institute process. That I found myself on a smoke break at work, talking to members of that organization who in Montreal had a small office and they had a political table. And it was something like they had a sign, provocative signage. One of which was, made some reference to the depopulation agenda, and they had some literature. And so I was like, oh, I got 15 minutes. Let's have a conversation. And I was surprised to see that these people knew these sorts of things that I was also studying. I did feel that I still knew more than this person who was talking to me, but at the what got me, and after the conversation, I took my leaflet and I walked away, but it kept bothering me that they were optimistic and I wasn't. Like they
Mm.
had a sense, despite knowing this, that there was something to be done. And not that I thought that having political tables on the side of the street was going to be the solution, but they had that sense. And so I was like, well, that put me on a bit of create a splinter in my mind. And I was like, well, how do I resolve that? Like, why is it and there was a lot of, they were telling me about things that I thinking that I was very, very astute on political factoids. I was surprised that I didn't know anything about, like the guy Lyndon LaRouche, who was he was still old at that time, 2006. He was like 84. Now he's dead. But they were telling me all about this dude and how he was the advisor to various governments at different times. And Indira Gandhi brought him into India to come up, chart out a policy in the 80s, and then she got killed. And Lopez Portillo it brought him to Mexico and asked him to come out with a policy that Portillo adopted, and so many other things like that. And I was like, damn, that I didn't know. And he ran for the presidency like 8 times. He got thrown in jail by like the FBI and Robert Mueller in the 80s. Like, so I
Wow.
was like, these are crazy stories. Why don't I know any of this? And so that put me onto a little bit more of a inquiry. And one of the members at the time challenged me to go down with them to Washington, D.C. for they called the weeks of action. So basically they had the different members, mostly younger people, go down once every few months to Washington and just like lobby, be like, gadflies,
Okay. Yeah.
various congressmen and stuff, and give them, there's weekly political magazines called EIR. So you'd give them that. You try to like ask to get to deliver a briefing or have a meeting with either a staff member or ideally the congressman or senator, and just basically give them an update on the world situation, invite them to a conference or something. Cause there were often like, political briefings for people in, the Congress or the embassy corps. So, you try. But for me, I didn't want to go. I'm in Canada. I'm like, no, the U.S. is a slave society I was studying FEMA camps and stuff, and internal barbed wire fence. And I'm like, I'm not going down there. Like, no. But they threw this question. The person I was having this fight with, who was trying to get me to go down, threw out a question to me, a paradox. They were using a Platonic dialogue. I didn't know it at the time, but that's what they were doing. They were actually having a Platonic dialogue with me, and they were basically getting me to admit all of the things that I know correctly about the New World Order. And then they got me to also basically in the dialogue, basically just say that one of the things that the oligarchy wants to do is reduce the world population, kill off like 90% of the population. And I was like, yeah, that's what they want to do. And he's like, can you prove them wrong? And I'm like, what do you mean? Can I prove them wrong? He's like, can you prove why they're wrong? And he got me. I was like, well, yeah, it's immoral. And he's like, yeah, but isn't it true that we're growing exponentially, and we're eating up more food increasingly and creating less space for other humans in time? Can you actually say that they're absolutely wrong in their worldview? And I ultimately I couldn't really scientifically refute why encouraging depopulation or population control was a bad thing. And I never thought about that. I was like, damn it, I actually think like the oligarchy. And he seemed to have an idea why there is no intrinsic limit to human potential for growth, but I didn't have that idea. So that was part of the challenge that, again, bothered me for another couple of weeks. And I was like, I got to go down. So I went down. And one of the things that caught my eye, because that was the first time I ever got out of my comfort zone, the armchair researcher. I never really got into a process.
Right. So I don't think many people do. I mean, it's that's a big transition itself from like somebody like myself. I'm happy to, I work full time and I do this as a hobby, and I am comfortable, sharing whatever I can and trying to help people with whatever I can. But to actually get involved in sort of the meat of the process of trying to change people's minds and go to things and become involved. I mean, you were at an institute, obviously they're trying to do things, but this was, in your mind, this was another layer yet to that, where you're actually going to like just separate that for me a little bit, because I imagine that the institute itself is oriented towards changing things, but this was like another step.
Yeah. So it as I discovered it more and more, and I began to like read the literature of like Lyndon LaRouche's writings and associated researchers who would publish a lot of very persuasive, good historic research and findings in their geopolitical journal and history journals, and I started just appreciating there was a way of thinking that incorporated principally culture, science, and music and the arts as primary to all of the other things that attracted me. So I was attracted to the conspiratorial discourse, the concept that maybe policies have been done in the past and that maybe could be done again by representatives of sovereign nation states using the power of the nation state against this parasitical thing that's latched onto us. I was persuaded and I was hungry for those kinds of solutions, but it wasn't really the substance. And again, I left this just to be full disclosure. I left that organization in 2016 for various reasons, dealing with interpersonal unworkable relationships that I was having to deal with. So I'm not really speaking for them now, but I'm just giving my personal experience. So the thing that I guess got me when I went to Washington was, well, number one, there's a lot of people all of a sudden. I was like, whoa, there's like people from like younger people from Australia, from Germany, from France, from like me. I was part of a small contingent from Canada sent down, and then from different states where they had like offices. At the time, there was a very robust, younger recruitment drive. So there were a lot of young people. And so yeah, like 200 young people just convene on Washington, D.C., and it was like kind of interesting to see that. Number two, going to like everybody was split off in teams of like 3 or 4 to go to various embassies, but also mostly congressional offices. And we were given like little lists. Okay, like you guys in this team are going to hammer these 20 offices, and you got this stack of EIRs and try to give this briefing. Now, the thing I was put in a group of like 3 people who were totally under-equipped, right? Like one guy's from Nigeria. Forgot his name now. Anyway, another girl is from Australia. And then there's me, a Canadian newbie, don't know much. I could talk about the New World Order and stuff, but that's not what a congressman wants to hear necessarily. So I'm like, I'm thinking I'm going to like learn from experienced people. It's not the case. So we're just like going around, trying to talk to people. And then I was surprised to find that in a number of cases, not all, there would be like a lot of people would just like roll their eyes like, oh, you guys again, fine, give me the EIR, go away. That was the name of the magazine. Some of them though were really interesting and were really interested in what we had to say, even though we're like totally underqualified. Like there's not even a single American in my team. Right. And like we got to Ted Kennedy's office, and I don't like Ted Kennedy. I'd known enough to see that he did some nasty stuff, but was he always evil, or like was he always pushing the drug legalization drive? Did he have a more human side? I didn't know. But his chief of staff comes out. He's like, "Oh, you guys are the LaRouche guys. Do you have the EIR?" Turns out this guy's been reading this thing religiously for years. And he asked for a briefing. I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm just listening to these guys give a briefing. I'm chiming in a little bit, but it turns out like they had a staff member that signed up to go to a geopolitical briefing, a little conference center that was set up a week later. And there were a number of staff offices where he had very similar experiences, very shockingly so. So there was like a sense that I was stepping into something that was an already existing fight that I didn't know about, but it was like, it made it more real, I guess. And later on coming to Canada, I was kind of exhilarated over the following couple of years with some of the other members. And we decided to do something similar in Ottawa in 2007, December, which involved like 5 months of organizing to make this 2-day conference happen. Based on the idea of, okay, like the financial system is set up to blow. It's either going to kill all of us, or if we get our shit together, we can do things like, at the time it was Glass-Steagall was the big thing we were promoting, was Restore Glass-Steagall, which calls for breaking up the banks, letting all of the speculators take their own losses, don't bail them out, and then, reorganize the banking system in a similar manner and principle as what was done in the 1930s to allow for national, like, productive credit to reinvest back into the real economy versus the financialized economy that has nothing value. So that was like the platform. The reality of the economic collapse was the key, though. Like, that's what we were constantly hammering at. And it became very real for me. Like, it was around that time that and it was because I joined before the housing market blew. But I remember also like organizing like in 2006 about the oncoming housing market subprime bubble that was going to blow, because this organization was looking at the time at the fictitiousness of the financial markets and the reality of the physical economy. That was like LaRouche's big contribution, was a method of analyzing physical economic processes and more importantly, the cultural field that allows for the increase qualitatively of physical economic systems over time. And that was like one of his contributions to the field of economic science back in the 50s. And it allowed him a predictive power too. So if he was on record with like major long-term forecasts that panned out pretty well,
right?
And he goes through his process. He tells you why. He's not making it like, it's not like a crystal ball or something. It's like he's just giving you like, okay, there's
Logic.
this much. Yeah, there's this much food production. You can measure relatively how much food production there is. There's this many people. There's this many people in farming. There's this much, and so you could judge whether a new policy is going to increase the bounty and thus the potential to support more people, or decrease it by virtue of, let's say, monetizing biofuels, which will take 50% of the corn production out of food and into burning it for cars for speculative purposes, right? So you could basically, there's a way of looking at it. I was like, okay, he even wrote a textbook on it that was helpful to me. And then I started realizing that America, the USA itself, which I had no connection to emotionally as a Canadian, we're in British Canada. You and I that's where we were born. And so our school system is designed to give us a particular lens upon which, or through which, to look at the US experience, which is not necessarily one that gives us any appreciation for it being anything more than an imperial, hypocritic, effort by slave owners to break free of the less evil British Empire, maybe,
Yeah.
So that was a big revelation in that process too, was just redefining what the American Revolution as an unfinished idea. It was never even close to perfect, but it was still better than what was before it. And it did introduce a new set of potentials around the idea that society could be organized around the consent of the governed, the concept of the inalienable rights that are there because not a sovereign gave us those rights like we have in Canada or the British Commonwealth, which is the concept of law, is that, you know, rights are there because a sovereign gives them and can thus take them away, but rather that we're all made in the living image of a creator. And so that's a much more solid foundation upon which human rights are premised, which is there in the founding fathers. So there's this idea that, okay, there has been a fight that's been going back a long time, that has allowed this quality of beauty and humanity to succeed and not be destroyed at times when it should statistically have been destroyed. And so that also fed back into my faith that something could be done in our present conditions, and I don't know what it would look like.
Right.
Yes, that's how it kind of like began shifting my hypothesis about optimism and cynicism to about God and human nature, right?
So let's talk about because I mean, some of the things I won't even be able to repeat them properly, but you're talking about like sensory perception versus, I don't want to say like just an idealized, but how do you, because it almost, I mean, it sounds a little bit magical thinking to somebody who is, used to just looking at news headlines and saying, oh, these are the players, these are the cards they're holding, and therefore this is the amount of things that can happen possibly. I mean, you can just go through it as a game like that. And it sounds like you have kind of a fundamentally different approach to it, which is, I still don't quite understand. It's something about potential and that, the undetermined future and how flexible things really are. And could you just kind of break that down for me?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, you're a man of faith, right? So
Yes.
You believe that the creator is a good creator, the maximum, the best creator possible. Like nothing could be better than the creator, right? And nothing could be more. He's maximum good, maximum reasonable. Like it would be not an irrational creator. Everything is done for reason and goodness.
I disagree with that.
Oh, okay. The creator might be irrational.
Irrational, yes, I do think. I have actually written about that, how God is irrational, and he admits he's irrational. He's a jealous God. He likes collective punishment, and he likes to predestine people for good things even though they don't deserve it. And there's a lot of things there that are not rationally proportioned. And
I didn't know that. I mean, I do remember actually, as you're speaking, I'm remembering actually little sections from your rabbit hole. What was the name of your book? I was
Fire in the Rabbit Hole was
Fire in the Rabbit Hole. Yeah, which is a lovely book. But there were a few things. Yeah, that's true. You're reminding me that you were touching on that too. I forgot about that. Okay, so that's a side conversation. Maybe we could circle back to that.
Sure.
So I'm operating on the assumption that God is ultimately the maximum good and not inclined to irrationalism. That's my assumption right now. So my organizing, one of my core hypotheses, let's just say. So easy to say. One of the questions I was asking, is the world that we live in enforces this notion that randomness is God, chaos is God. That whether it's in the quantum realm or whether it's in genetic, like Darwinian genetics, ultimately randomness in genetics or randomness in the behavior of the atom or the electrons around the atom or the neutrons and positive. I was going to say positive electrons. Protons, thank you. Inside of the nucleus is random in their ultimate behavior, and that the appearance of beauty, the appearance of order and symmetry is actually just a mirage that betrays the reality of chaos that governs all. And that we have just these emergent systems where randomness will occasionally give rise to ordering things. But it in that like gospel, I will call it a nihilistic gospel. That
it is in a way,
yeah. And a lot of it, it's purely, it's not scientific. It's calling itself science. It's gotten influence over many of the top peer-reviewed and scientific journals, and also the funding of how science funding happens, R&D happens, how the universities are wired to teach certain doctrines about models of the atom and life. But it's not true. It's actually not premised on any actual discoveries. It came in, a big chunk of this, especially in the physics, came in the 1920s by Rockefeller-funded financing of the Copenhagen School of Quantum Mechanics. And this is basically a school of statistical probability theorists around a guru named Niels Bohr. And here I'm including Wolfgang Pauli and Heisenberg, basically a bunch of guys who never made any discoveries in their lives. They made, they were like mathematical prodigies who were obsessed with probability and rolling dice and gambling. And that's where the whole debate, the famous dispute between Einstein and Niels Bohr comes in, where Einstein was trying to make Einstein, who actually made positive contributions and insights into our understanding of physical reality that had predictive power and that increased human power, even though there were, I'm not saying that there weren't flaws, but there was something real there. He understood that there was a sickness in thinking of those who are presuming that God plays dice with the universe, that God ultimately has a proclivity to gamble, to not, and he wasn't
that I would
alone.
also reject, even with the presumption that there, I would say God has irrational, traits, and his emotional relationship with humanity is not a steady, calculated, rational relationship. But yeah, that much I would certainly say. I think that the creation and the mechanics of the world and stuff is not fun. Is not that chaotic. It's but yeah, continue.
I had a feeling. Yeah, no, I had a feeling that you'd have that position. Yeah, because there's something about the essence of the creator that flows through their art, right? So there's a spark of the essence of being that flows through the process of creation, that you would get a sense like that when you look at a Jackson Pollock or some random abstract painting. You're like, there's something scrambled, even though it's a scrambled painting. I'm looking at it. That's showing me a fragment of the scrambledness inside of your head and soul of the painter who's doing this, right? And then of the society that's got something scrambled and sick within it, that's thinking that it's justifiable to spend $400 million on one of these paintings, which took 2 hours to make, splattering paint. So all that to say, like that's when you look at Einstein's battles, or he was very close friends with Max Planck and Madame Curie, Marie Curie. They were together. They were all fighting the people, the old guard, they call them, the old guard who had made the discoveries, the revolutionary discoveries that opened up an appreciation for this new realm of reality on the quantum domain that also had implications on how we perceive and analyze the structure of galaxies. There's a reciprocity that as we open up the door of our understanding to the geometry of the atom and its behavior to heat and light, we also get an increased power and dominion over nature, that it gives us an ability to sustain more of our people at a higher quality of existence, as long as the culture outpaces the process of scientific progress. Because if you allow the scientific progress to speed up, but you allow at the same time that the culture degenerates, well, then we've got dumber and dumber, more corrupt people expected to use more powerful like instruments, which then would have the atom be used increasingly towards destructive ends and building bombs instead of desalinating ocean water and feeding people, right? So
that reminds me, actually, just as a note on that, it reminds me of like Carol Quigley's analysis of how civilizations develop, and he, like in Tragedy and Hope, it's my favorite part of the book. I know a lot of people focus on the Anglo-American establishment and stuff because he was dropping really powerful secrets in his books and stuff, but the way that he talked about things developing is like, it really matters the order in which a civilization encounters, religion and hygiene and technology and these different things. And that if a culture got powerful weapons, but they had not yet developed like a respectful culture of trust-based society with all this safeguards in place and whatever, then you get X, Y, and Z type of countries that, have warlords and stuff, because now they have this degenerate or this factional, combative, power, fear-based terror society and stuff. But then now suddenly they have these powerful weapons. And he said that the only reason why like something like America or these, Western civilizations had flourished so much was because they encountered these things in the correct order, so that they got the power after they had already developed, the culture that was suitable for it. I thought that was I've been thinking about that ever since I read that many years ago. But
Yeah, that's a
anyway,
solid insight. No, that's true. That's very true, and very few people pick up on that way of thinking. But I didn't even realize that he did that, and I got the book behind me, and I clearly didn't read that part of it. Um, that's because that's the sort of secret sauce at the end of the day, and I think that the oligarchy. That's why I've come increasingly to the conclusion that they place their greatest emphasis and priority on the levers of culture more than the physical or even intellectual battles to control the ideologies within the school system, and that will map out onto the society and even more than the physical aspects of the mind, body, soul, right? So they operate on all three, but the one that they put the most effort in is the one people pay the least amount of attention to, which is the question of the aesthetics and the aesthetical sensibilities that temper that kind of provide. Because what is culture? It's like it's this invisible real thing that shapes how we prioritize our values, how we interpret the data that we get through our senses,
yeah,
and
I
that
mean, people
right.
die for a culture. I mean, people will
Yeah.
literally like do suicidal things to in order to fit in. Like they
Mm.
will like talk the drugs and the self abusive things and this like joining movements that are uh, dangerous and gangs and whatever. Like the need to fit in and the need to like that's why it's such a powerful lever is because there's fundamentally this like this effort, this desire to join something larger and to be
Mm.
part of the community and stuff. It's not many people are comfortable with being outside or
Sheltering.
ostracized. And
Yeah.
then so if they can
Yeah.
control the consensus in that way, like that's why I just call it social engineering. I think that's it's a nice way of putting it, but
Mhm.
it's yeah, they're putting so much effort, trillions of dollars every year. If you think about the total combined effort of schools, media, all the NGOs and all the lobbying and stuff that goes on, controlling all the editorial and producers at different stages of bottlenecks of cultural control and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
for sure, I think that's so. If I'm picking up what you're saying, it's like we have this we have this powerful insights into technology and studying and measuring nature and sort of being able to break it down and then harvest powerful things
Well,
from it, but then it's being used by people who are geared towards controlling culture and steering
yeah,
it.
so there's two aspects of that. Number one is that when I began to explore, again, within the context of the curriculum that I had encountered within the organization that had this encouragement of studying people who make discoveries and then read their writings for good or for bad, try to appreciate the battle lines between, let's say, a Platonic versus Aristotelian set of thinkers and how their ideas are not actually what we're told as being one comes in a complementary way from Plato, and that we're told that Aristotle advanced Plato's ideas, maybe made them more useful, but actually the core of the entire method of how the ideas come into being and um, how we understand anything, the method itself are opposing. They're not complementary. They're not even just different. They're actually opposing. And I'm not trying to say this from a Manichaean standpoint. It's just like one actually bears fruit and the other one bears the illusion of fruit with none of the substance by design. Um, and so and we could unpack that later, but you see the same kind of this clash of methods, which
Mhm.
also deals with the spiritual and the attitude domain of like optimism grounded on what on actual justifiable evidence of faith, like is your faith founded on a solid foundation or a flaky foundation that of sand, right, upon which the castle of faith will collapse because it's not grounded on anything just. So that's a repetition thing. But so on the one hand, the oligarchy can't themselves make revolutionary discoveries of universal principles. They actually can't do that. I have been told by the oligarchy that's trying to run my society of a narrative that paints representatives of the oligarchical system as the cause of great discoveries, like say, for example, Isaac Newton or Charles Darwin or Niels Bohr. But Isaac Newton's a great example. both him and later Darwin were members of the Rosicrucian Invisible College. Like they were alchemical numerologists, or especially Sir Isaac Newton. Was an alchemist who was a numerologist. He was somebody who was managed, just like Darwin is managed by Thomas Huxley later. So is Newton managed by his own. There's a network like Samuel Clarke and I'm forgetting the name. Christopher Wren was another Rosicrucian founder of the Invisible College who were managing them. And what they were doing was they were trying to steal ideas made by real people, right, of universals, and then extract simply the outward shell, calling it a basically symbolic formula that it's associated with some syllogistic justification of, I don't want to use too many fancy words for the audience's sake, but I mean, they basically tried to use a formula that could be tautological, self-referential when you justify, like, well, why is the inverse square law
it's almost
true?
like a circular logic extended out to the point where
it's true because it works. Why does it work? Well, it works because it's true. It works because, it works because as the object based upon its mass moves away from the center of gravitational field, that the effect of the field will be reduced by a factor of the inverse of the square of the distance that they have together, right? So you're like, is that a sufficient reason why it's true? No, it's not a sufficient reason why it's true. It's just that's something that happens. That's
doesn't
not
go to the root cause of anything.
No, not get close, right? And that's by design. So they transpose the how for the why, and they say why has no place in science, right?
That's true. That's true.
And so and then they repackage it because the discovery still happened. They can't ignore the fact that, but they can't, if they can't get rid of the discovery, though they will typically try. But if they can't, it's out of the bottle. What they can do is try to repackage it and repurpose who made it and how we think about it. So they say, well, we need to create an Isaac Newton. We'll say apples fall on his head, and we'll say that that's how genius discoveries are made, fruit falling on people's heads. And we'll give him laws. We'll infuse laws of thinking into his books that tell other people who want to be great like him what they're not allowed to do if they want to make discoveries.
Right,
of which he says, if you want to make discoveries, there's a law of reason that he promotes, which is do not make hypotheses. So you're allowed to take data, look for patterns, extrapolate patterns into general laws that are replicatable, but that's it. Do not make hypotheses of first causes. And yet, when you look at Gottfried Leibniz, who actually did discover the infinitesimal calculus, or you look at Johannes Kepler, who actually did discover all of the foundations for that was later stolen and called the inverse square law, they could not have made their discoveries had they not had a deep and abiding faith in a harmonious creator that created the universe through reason and harmony. I'm not trying to dispel what you were saying earlier. I'm not saying that there was not something additional of chaos too. I'm not saying that, but I don't think there is. But they had to have that faith that there was a harmoniousness and a goodness to.
I mean, that's why I like the older, like, instead of whatever scientist means, the natural philosopher seemed like a more.
Yeah,
it's in a way, it's a better description, a better way of thinking of it is that you're a philosopher who looks at nature. You look at nature as something to be discussed in terms of why. And like I appreciate that if I was going to try to do that, that's how I would approach it as a natural philosopher. And then as you're talking, I'm thinking of Thomas Aquinas and his, worship of Aristotle and his, trying to rework Aristotle and the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church being this defender of Aristotle weirdly for so long. And then the Jesuits being famously equivocators and loving to confuse people with terminology and trap them in linguistic bubbles. And Jesuitry itself as a term was a term for confusing people with language, to use words to mask meaning and to lead people into weird semantic rabbit holes and stuff that they can't get out of because you're using the wrong language to start with. And like Francis Bacon and his empiricist, discovery. I don't even know where Bacon fits in the timeline of Newton.
Yeah.
How far apart, and what is the relationship there?
Yeah, I think, well, Bacon in many ways, I would say is the cause of Newton. In the sense that Yeah, and I've got a friend who you might want to even talk to at some point. He's an engineer, and he's a pretty good physicist, and he's written a book on fields, and he gave a class to my Rising Tide Foundation a few months ago on Francis Bacon that I really enjoyed. And in it, he makes a clear case using Bacon's Novus Organum and his New Atlantis as well, of an alchemical trap of the mind that he set into place, utilizing the precedents, and this is me saying this, but it's true, of the earlier John Dee, the intelligence occultist who had his strange
Enochian angel worship and
yeah, that guy, yeah, with like the what's his name, Edward Kelly, and they were like going through the courts of England and then Bohemia and trying to like create these little espionage centers and networks of cultists that would then infiltrate and take control of policy. But John Dee had a book. He basically wrote the foreword and translated Euclid's Elements, and he in his foreword, which is a very influential thing that he did in 1580 or so, he outlines the importance of Euclid, but he binds it to magic, right? And this idea of radical Aristotelian inductive and deductive, because Aristotle does use both. He uses senses and he uses logic, but it's rooted in the same thing that makes Euclid also useful for oligarchical control. It's hard to say. Run by a magician class, which is what? Where's the magic trick? Well, the magic trick is that they promote systems that allow for a mimicry of reality, but they bind it to core axioms. So Euclid has his axioms and postulates and definitions that are unquestionable. Like the parallel postulate of Euclid presumes that, two lines when perpendicular to a third line will, if moving in a straight direction, will never ever cross. Now, it's true from an abstract Cartesian space, a Euclidean empty space, correct. However, we don't live in that abstract mathematical space. We live in reality. And in reality, there's curvature. And where there's curvature, those two lines will always find a way to meet. They will not always be perfectly adjacent. So another thing that Euclid does is, as a sleight of hand, here, this is a really dubious one. He says, okay, we all want to explore reality, right? So to explore reality, we need certain assumptions about reality, certain universal assumptions. And here's one of the assumptions you have to adopt, and it's unquestionable. You cannot question this and still be a Euclidean. And one of those is that, okay, well, there's a one-dimensional, a two-dimensional, a three-dimensional aspect of reality, right? Cubes and squares and lines. And he then starts defining what a line is. And he says, well, a line everyone will acknowledge, or a point. He starts with a point. So he's like, a point must be defined first as being have that existence that has no breadth, width, or height. And he says, well, what's a line? A line is an infinite accumulation of points that only has length but no breadth or height. The line. What is the square? The square has only breadth and height, but it has no width, and it's made of an infinite accumulation of lines. Okay, so he's redefined now square and line as being infinite points for a line, infinite lines for a square, infinite squares for a cube, or any type of structure, right? But where was the sleight of hand? So now you can start building realities. Like now you can start exploring reality and defining, like spheres and defining planetary orbits, and you can define all of these things about reality, but you have to hold on to his court. So do you see it? Do you see the sleight of hand?
I mean, it's something that sounds strange to me. It's just the idea of the infinite points and stuff like that. I'm not sure if I see the sleight of hand at all.
Well, it's pretty much, yes, you're right. It's that everything becomes, in your mind's eye, built up by a bunch of nothings. That nothingness causes somethingness. Bam. Like that's the mind fuck right there. Sorry for the language. But as soon as you're doing that, now you have an ontological absurdity that you have at the core of your system. And so you think you're doing science, you think you're building math. And he also doesn't tell you how his mathematical you know, he gives you all of the different like rules of how to calculate the area of a triangle or a square or an obtuse angle, but he doesn't actually tell you how those discoveries were made, and he has baked in absurd axioms that you have to just hold on to and unquestion. And so in Aristotle's system as well, there's core axioms that you have to abide by without that are beyond your reason's ability to even investigate. So it becomes actually articles of more religious faith than it does natural philosophy. Like, for example, that certain people are born slaves, certain people are born masters, and that Aristotle says is something that you have to assume is baked into the fabric of reality, and nobody is allowed to even question that. He creates it as a law of thinking that then kind of, and then people say, oh, but later on he says things like nice things about how everybody, even slaves, have reason, and that if you have reason, you deserve liberty. Okay, he says that, but at the same time, he also defines the slave as being one category of human that's different from the child, that's different from the woman, that's different from the man, that each one has different virtues, different justices,
roles.
Yeah, so there's no principles that are universal, and on top of that, he says that only the slave owner, the male slave owner, has both reason and the power to act upon reason. Whereas the female has both reason but not the power to act. The kid has neither reason nor the power, and the slave has reason but no power. So basically, in Aristotle's framework, right, even though he says these nice things that parallel reason, they're not reasonable, because they would assume, if you abide by it, that only he who has reason and power may cause an action resulting in the freedom of a slave. So we would never have an American Revolution. We never would have had Frederick Douglass or Helen Keller or anybody who was oppressed actually fight for freedom. The fighting for freedom of those who are oppressed becomes impossible in this framework.
And that explains perfectly why Thomas Aquinas liked it, and why the Catholic Church held on to it, because they liked the static medieval feudalist, hierarchical structure where everything is in its proper place. The right people are always in power, and the people who are disenfranchised or have nothing, that's their role, and they should just be content with that. And I could see why that would be a convenient, ideology for those who want to just sort of sit on top and keep things static. In fact, so static that it's like the Byzantine Empire, like the perfect society that they believed they would never change because nothing ever needed to change. And that's radically different from the idea that everything can change and we can discover more principles and upset the apple cart and change things around.
Yeah. And the thing with Thomas Aquinas as well is that he himself was devoted, he was used to justify a legal argument that would ultimately promote and justify more crusades, which was the desire of the papacy at the time, was to get the crusades up and rolling again. And people often forget that was one of his commissions, which he did loyally. And I think his Summa Theologica was explicitly designed to try to undo the reality that people like Dante Alighieri and Petrarch and Boccaccio had observed, which is that the Platonic versus Aristotelian schism and method is very real. And many of those who were fighting to create the biggest bursts of progress and reduce the influence of the oligarchy through the battle over culture were very aware of this, and that had very much immersed themselves in a thorough study of both Aristotle and Plato, and had sided with the Platonic method that presumes everybody has an immortal soul made good, that everybody has that intrinsic thing in them, and that that education should not be just putting things into a student, but rather awakening the flame. So you're not like doing in Aristotle, it's you're putting things into, because everything is nouns, everything is objects you memorize, syllogistic systems that you can bring in and memorize and repeat. But the idea of like awakening a discovery, there's no process. Aristotle gives you crystallized answers already fully furbished about the definition of whatever you want. You want to know what virtue is? Read his definition. If you want to know what justice is, Read that definition.
So, like,
But there,
for my like, because
yeah,
my listeners are probably somewhat, lost at this point, even though we're trying to keep it somewhat,
right,
able to be accessible. But like, so Aristotle writes the organum, uh, or I don't know what the proper term would be, but it's basically like a whole um, system of categorizing absolutely everything logically, and in the physical world, everything becomes defined and categorized, and then um, Francis Bacon, in the 1500s or whatever it was, um, he creates the novum organum, which is the like new organon, the new form of Aristotle's thing, where he wants to come back, revisit that same idea, and categorize everything. But he uses this empiricist method where you
yeah,
do controlled experiments and you ignore all
yeah,
other factors and all this kind of stuff. So that to me is an important through line that is pretty simple. You can get
right,
Aristotle's.
right. And he criticizes Aristotle. So
Mhm.
Bacon is professes to be an anti-Aristotelian. He's also a collaborator of Paolo Sarpi, a leading Venetian strategist, very, very powerful figure in grand strategy, who's very close in creating a plan, a program through Venice that Bacon is a key player within. But
Oh,
I don't
okay.
think even Bacon is necessarily setting the tone for it. This is the grouping that's also setting up what becomes the Rosicrucian manifestos and the emergence of Rosicrucianism in 1614. But you're right. So he creates like there's a very contrived debate between Aristotle, who Bacon and Sarpi both say is outdated, right? And because what are they dealing with? Well, from 1460 really, but it really began spiking in the early 1500s, was this explosion of new discoveries, new inventions, beautiful revolutions in the arts and architecture and painting, perspective, you name it, like in medicine, astronomy, everything was being positively revolutionized by new insights through the method, a particular method that had spread, especially through things like the Brethren of Common Life, which was an educational movement that
Hmm.
was put into motion by Petrarch and Dante earlier. That was premised on the idea of teaching orphans the best and highest caliber of culture and literacy of the Greek and Latin texts that they could then transcribe, restudy, and a lot of these youth, and there were hundreds of these Brethren of Common Life teaching centers all over Europe. It's quite something. A lot of them were inspired by Thomas à Kempis's writing as well. But it was all premised on this notion that the spark of genius is contained in everybody, even in low-born orphans who normally would be discarded as like mud.
Hmm.
And these became the vanguard leadership and advisors of many of the leading states in the end of the 1400s and throughout the 1500s. Da Vinci emerged out of this process as well. So you had this explosion that of brilliant ideas. The genius was out of the bottle, so to speak. And because they couldn't put it back in, what they had to do is to say, well, okay, the old method of trying to stop genius, which is the Aristotelian Thomas Aquinas way of trying to merge Plato and Aristotle and just create sort of rules of thinking that they would impose onto scholasticism and academia and everything else, that wasn't working. So they had to acknowledge that it wasn't working
Hmm.
and then come up with a new way of adapting. They're very adaptive. They don't make discoveries. They adapt to discoveries in order to destroy them and what allows the discoveries to happen. So they said, okay, let's allow for a limited type of progress. We'll call it technique. We'll say that we hate Aristotle or we're against Aristotle and that we're going to like now create a system of sense perception where people are allowed to, again, memorize formulas, look for data,
Hmm.
take empirical data, try to find patterns, and then extrapolate the patterns a posteriori into universal laws. And that was the Baconian method, is a posteriorism. Aristotle's a priorism. You start with general assumed
Hmm.
laws, and then you plug in your data into the framework that is rooted in those core axioms. Same thing for Euclid. It was a priori. And then the inverse would be the Paolo Sarpi, Francis Bacon method that starts with senses, looks for patterns, and then extrapolates out the universals from the patterns. Though you couldn't actually make a discovery that way if you tried. It allows for people to have the illusion of thinking that they're doing science, but they're cutting off the part of themselves that would normally be able to discover the eureka of like what is the principle that, let's say, Kepler, who is looking at musicality, he's looking at the Platonic program of the Timaeus, and seeing that's what he's testing out, is the Timaeus dialogue 2,000 years earlier, where Plato's Timaeus is outlining a theory of musicality organizing the tempering of the different planets, as well as the nesting of the five Platonic solids that generate certain ratios that Plato asserts through Timaeus's voice, and which Kepler is reading and trying to see if it's true. The framework around the structure of reality. Is that something that's just an abstraction, like Euclidean abstraction, or is it something that is discoverable and that applies to giving us an understanding of why planets are where they are, why snowflakes have six sides, which is the name of one of Kepler's essays, and he's very Platonic about it. So in the Baconian Paulo Sarpi way, that's gone. You're not allowed to do that. And even in the New Atlantis, Bacon frames the type of ideal society that has hyper rigid, compartmentalized specialists, each one doing their own thing. One group of specialists is trained just to think up of new scientific experiments. Another group, not that same group, is trained to do the experiments. Another group is trained to interpret the experiments, and another group is trained to find mathematical expression for those.
So they don't want a polymath, cross-discipline type, person who can see everything and how it's connecting into larger principles. It's all compartmentalized progress.
Yes, exactly. And so, and I think there's even a remark in the New Atlantis, which is a short essay. It's like 45 pages. It's very easy to read, but it's garbage. Where he like something to the effect that for the foreseeable future, scientists must be confined to measuring cucumbers or something like that, like something banal, because they're like, we should allow it, but that's what we should permit it to be, and nothing more. And so Newton is largely an expression of the Bacon project, which is why Francis Bacon was used as a symbol for the Invisible College Royal Society after the English Civil War finally wore itself out. And it was a Rosicrucian sabotage. It could have been something good, but it became a Rosicrucian sabotage. And there's a story there too. But then Bacon is used as the symbol, rightfully so, because they're being honest. And so when Newton comes out of kind of nowhere as this Kabbalistic alchemist who's obsessed with himself, the guy's like so self-important, it's crazy. He wants people to call him like Jehovah or something. Like he thinks he's the Messiah. Not that different psychologically speaking from a Descartes, I would say, actually. Yeah. And maybe Newton wouldn't have even been necessary. I've seen a persuasive case that Newton would not have even been necessary if Leibniz earlier, who was an actual follower of Plato and Kepler, had not done such a good job at annihilating Descartes and the Cartesian framework of a mechanistic universe. If he hadn't done such a fabulous job, they wouldn't have needed to create what becomes an Isaac Newton later on, but they did. And they had to steal Leibniz's discoveries and repackage it for Newton and other things. So yeah, Newton, if you look at his Principia Mathematica, it's basically Euclid. It's Principia is just, it's an encyclopedic accumulation of a descriptive math, no sufficient reason, like no first causes, no first principles, rules of reasoning that say you can't think about thinking, you can't think about hypothesizing. And to the degree that people believe that he actually made those discoveries, they will, and try to emulate his method, they won't make discoveries. They might make little tiny techniques or improvements upon techniques, but they can't make discoveries. And going back to Einstein and Planck, they knew that because they made discoveries, and Planck writes essays in celebration of Kepler, who he studied and who gave him a lot of the method that he had developed, which he goes at in his Philosophy of Physics essay in 1938. He's going through the metaphysical principles of the method that he used to bear fruit in discovering the quantization of photons and of matter. As you increase heat on black bodies, there's certain like curvatures of certain spectral curvatures of how much energy you need to you get out of the process of heating that results in these kind of like strange lines like that Einstein helps him find a way of communicating what's going on by their mutual description of how light has both a wave-like but also photon-like aspect. It doesn't mean that it's both. It just means that it has both attributes. There might be something else that we haven't even discovered yet, which they both believe there is, that accounts for why in certain cases light and EM radiation has a wavefront aspect, and another light packets, which there are Platonists like Louis de Broglie, who probably went further than anyone and who was an enemy of the Copenhagen school, who was looking at things like the leader wave, or the idea that you have certain I don't want to get too off topic. So all that to say, the thing that makes them work culturally, because we were talking about culture earlier, why culture always has to lead in the dance of the material progress, is that these guys were also musicians. And this is a big part of Einstein and Max Planck's self-conscious. They were always hammering at the fact that if you want to be able to be the most fruitful quality of yourself, you can't allow your soul to be fragmented as a thinker or a feeler or an artist or a scientist. And they would, and they describe their process beautifully. When they would be intellectually stuck on a problem, they would go and play Mozart together. They would, Einstein was a beautiful violinist, and Max Planck was a concert pianist, and they would perform, and they would find qualities awoken.
So like harmony is like the key principle of what they're doing. It's trying to harmonize everything, whereas the opposite side is trying to fragment everything and keep everything isolated and siloed. And then you're allowed to do this, but presumably, I would think, with all that fragmentation, all the separate studies, the idea of Bacon, that there should be all these specialists who do these mundane small studies and stuff, that you're feeding all of that back into something, into the invisible college or into some central body that could then collect all those insights. And they still value the collected wisdom in a way, but they don't want people out there to sort of have cross-discipline understanding of everything. So these other guys are harmonizing everything, and I think would you agree that that seems to be how it works, is that there's even with the fragmented scientism sort of look at everything, that there's still a group somewhere that is trying to harvest all of this. They just don't want you or me or the average person to be able to look at everything in a harmonized way.
Yeah, well, that's also one of the reasons why I've been able to cultivate more of a sense of a philosophy of optimism as well, because I can now say that I've never seen any evidence that this class, I'll call it a class, why not, of the sorcerer types who are vetted to think in those terms and do those things in service of the beast. They can't do the discovery themselves. What they can do is identify, at best, their quality of, because they have a certain intersectional thinking. They don't compartmentalize. They do compartmentalize some things about themselves, but they don't have the problems that they want their victims to have. So they can, because of that, they have a certain access to a type of creative insight. They have access to, they can identify where creative processes are happening that are a danger to them. They could see and identify, they can read a Kepler, they can read a Leibniz, and know enough to figure out what they can extract out of it to repackage and sell to people who don't know what they know. That Isaac Newton is the guy who discovered the calculus and gravity and optics. So they have this type of like evil insight. It does exist, but they can't make the discovery. I've never seen any evidence of one of these profiles making a discovery, only stealing and repackaging. And also, if I look at like the modern day, one of the, especially since World War II, one of the domains where science has really been incubated and grown has been under the control of the military and intelligence sector, especially through the continuation of the Manhattan Project in the West. DARPA came out of that, yeah. So if there are concrete case studies we can find of good scientists using a healthy method, like the Pons and Fleischmann grouping in the 80s, who were making revolutionary breakthroughs in cold fusion. and overthrowing entire textbooks of assumptions through this simple, elegant experiments that they were building, that allowed for, I think it was like lithium to be generated in abundance using not super hot superconductors and plasmas. They didn't have to do any of that stuff. They just set up their system with different sets of assumptions, and just simply allowed these very simple tests that you could do at any university. Kids could do these types of things and discover that there's something else going on that allows for the fusing of neutrons or nucleuses from different elements into each other that involve such questions as like least action pathways within both plasma, but also in non-plasma situations, or maybe everything is plasma that we're not even realizing it, right? That's another question. But so Pons and Fleischmann are making these breakthroughs in cold fusion. James Bussard, the father of plasma rockets, scramjets as well in for NASA in the 60s, he gets iced out, but he continues to be productive, and he starts utilizing platonic solids as the baseline of his design for fusion, basically almost cold fusion systems that are very cheap to build, that utilize like truncated icosahedra shapes that allow for a certain type of resonance. When you have a bit of a plasma inserted, there's a certain resonance function that goes on that allows for an increased tendency of fusion reactions. And he's producing iteration after iteration, and is getting money all of a sudden out of nowhere when he begins to bear fruit. I'm talking here like early 90s, and he begins to bear fruit. And now all of a sudden, Lockheed Martin, the US Navy intelligence is pouring money into him, and he's a naive guy. He's happy that he can build his prototypes and test his ideas. So he's taking the money, he's signing stuff. And he doesn't realize that as soon in 2007, when his like 8th iteration is now really gung-ho and overthrowing whole class like systems of previous, mathematical wisdom, he gets iced out. It gets absorbed into the machine, into the shadow,
national security apparatus of some kind. Yeah.
And at that point, they probably kept working on it. They got their own teams of intelligent monkeys, kind of, like working and tweaking the thing, but they couldn't do the thing. They couldn't. Right. They needed a Jim Bussard who thinks like a Kepler, but then they will ice him out or they'll kill him. Whatever. We've seen enough examples of great scientists who do die strange deaths as they're making breakthroughs. So that's another way of doing it. And then you absorb their discovery and you get your tinkerers to continue to try to, but they can't do it. That's the key thing at the end of the day, is that, or like, I've never seen a single example, including in music. Like they can mimic Mozart. There's actually some interesting, powerful Rosicrucians whose names I'm not even going to say publicly, who I think are controlling a big, because they're alive and they're doing it. They're in play, and they're also cryptographers, coders, as well as, so they do pretty advanced calculus. They work with prime numbers. They could do some crazy, interesting stuff. But they're also musicians, prominent musicians, who when you listen to the compositions that they're producing, it fools the ear into thinking that could have been done. The polyphony, the multi-layered voicing of the music, it could have been a Mozart. It could have been a Beethoven. It's really that good. But it's still lacking. It's still mimicking ultimately the patterns of Beethoven. It's not, they couldn't be the person that revolutionizes music that way.
Right. So I got two maybe last questions, because you've touched on so much here. Two things that just stand out to me, that I got to get your opinion on then is, when you talk about quantum physics, it sounds like, that opens the door to, I mean, we hear anybody who talks about quantum physics and quantum science is making it sound like this does change all of the assumptions. And so now we're looking at them making it sound like we can rewrite all the rules, and that, the universe is, your consciousness affects it. And there's like things that just, obviously the new age runs with this real hard and makes it sound like, we can manifest different realities just by thinking about it. And they're not talking about first principles and scientific stuff. They're talking about magical thinking and all that stuff. So I think I talked about this in Fire in the Rabbit Hole. But the holographic universe idea, the idea that the universe is this this manifestation, and it's, you know, very theosophical and stuff, but it's presented as science. I mean, this book definitely tries to present as science. It's very I'm concerned about the um, susceptibility of people culturally who know that traditional science is now you know, corrupt, and it's all driven by money, and it's all about depopulation, and it's all very negative and controlled. um, the idea that there can be these huge breakthroughs because science is basically um, intertwined with spirituality and consciousness. And so I just want your opinion on all of that. The idea that um, how that's being used, where it's coming from, where do you think that's going? And then also AI as the thing that, you know, consolidates all of this fragmented information, and that these uncreative
Mm,
elites, social engineers who don't have good insights, they can get those insights by having this huge consolidation machine of AI and large language models, and feeding in enough information that they can discover, you know, new things. What do you think about either of those or
mm.
both of those?
Okay. Well, I guess, and they're connected questions, so it's lawful that you posed it the way you did. I'm quite persuaded that the notion, the narrative that AI and large language models will be able to do actual human quality discoveries is a lie that is known to be a lie by those perpetuating it. And I'm not even talking about Elon Musk who perpetuates it, because I think he's kind of a wind up toy himself. I don't think he comes up with, I would put Elon, if I had to categorize his type, as the same type, maybe a little bit dumber than Isaac Newton, as a synthetic shell of
He's a
an
front
automaton.
man for a whole other operation that's
Yeah, with a
going on.
giant ego that thinks he's really awesome, maybe even godlike, perhaps, as Newton thought he was, perhaps, but who can't actually defend any of the great discoveries he is supposed to have made, and the patents, the 19 patents he has attributed to him, that he can't actually defend any of those things in
Mhm.
public settings with non-controlled environments.
Yeah,
Um,
when you just hear him talk freely, it makes less and less sense.
It does. There's nothing there. It's personality, kind of, that he's been trained to have certain syllogistic, responses, certain ways of mimicking feelings and attitude, but there's not much there. And because he's so rich, he must be a genius. Like, it comes down to that kind of like low level thing. So, but he promotes this idea that computers or AI will soon be doing real pioneering discoveries. Now, I don't think anybody who's actually at the top pushing this AI God narrative believes that. I'm quite persuaded that they're using their narrative and weaving it with the help of some sci-fi narratives that have also been baked into shaping our collective dream, because that's really where the imagination is the battleground, and who controls the fiction controls the dreaming, and who controls the dreaming controls our responsiveness and how we interpret our values and how we interpret the data. So the sci-fi and these things are more important than people realize in everything, whether it's
That's why
on
H.G. Wells is somebody I can't stop thinking about his work
yeah,
and
yeah,
his literal blueprints for a world revolution, new world order, like,
yeah,
model, and then he's writing the science fiction, and it's like almost explicitly about running these hypothetical situations. What if Martians invaded? I guess we shouldn't have borders. I guess we should have no
yeah,
sovereignty, and, you know,
yeah,
like, it's pretty obvious how he's using science fiction to plant the seeds that whole generations will then, without challenging it, without critiquing his motives or where that's coming from, like, they just think, well, this is, you know, we have flaws in our system, and I see it now because of this science fiction. Anyway, go on.
yeah. That's going to be one of the upcoming films we end up doing, is on the occult initiation of sci-fi writers who are vetted to be permitted to be the influencers. And if you look at like Robert Heinlein, or even Philip K. Dick, or even Isaac Asimov, or even Gene Roddenberry, or there's a big list, you'll find some occult proclivity and initiation behind their identity and experience, including the generation of like the foundation, or like what was behind a lot of the George Lucas, even Steven Spielberg. Like, you'll find always that. and so they're vetted because that's the power. That's the real power, is the culture. That it's not just in the music, where people now clearly see the witches coming out of the closet all over the place, and the Abramovich handlers managing and grooming the influencers in the music scene. But you're seeing it everywhere now, and it's always been there, but to varying degrees. Today it's gotten worse. Now I'm saying this. Why am I saying this? Because of your question. So the when it comes to, okay, so let's jump quickly back to so AI. Yeah, I think that they're just trying to be absolved of the crimes that they want to commit by attributing, so that they want to get the victims of their crimes to think that the attribution of the acts of crime is the AI gods and not the actual purveyors of the crime. And that only works if they can reduce our mental powers to the status of some form of human computer. So if they get humans to think like computers and not realize what the real taste of the sublime and real discoveries actually do and awaken within us, if we don't get those experiences, then we cannot refute their arguments that humans will be made irrelevant by these self-thinking machines that will deem us parasites to be exterminated.
So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because we're initiated into that belief that nothing can be done, and this is the true power that is going to take over everything.
Yeah, exactly. And then it can be colored and added onto with like alien narratives as well. That there's that it's interdimensional aliens that are actually also the AI, and the AI is the expression of a demonic force, and that's maybe the Antichrist, says Peter Thiel, and so there's different ways of spinning it, but it all gives you to the same place, which is, I think, where the oligarchy is just happy to be absolved of the crimes that they want to commit, so that the people with pitchforks don't know where to go when they're burned. That's where I'm at. As far as the holographic universe and things like that, so I like starting at discoverable principles that my mind can go through. So, like, for example, like, there's this beautiful book by Kepler. It's called Harmony of the World, and it takes you through his third law of planetary motion, and it's a beautiful read of philosophy. He starts by really undermining Euclid. He begins with where Euclid ends his elements at the very end on the golden section and the five Platonic solids. That's how Euclid ends. He starts with invisible points that make up everything, then he ends with the golden section and solids. Kepler does the opposite. He's like, no. You start with top down, right? You start with the golden section as your first principle, that there's something embedded within this ratio that induces beauty in the heart of man. Start with that, and then see how that proportion is needed to construct the pentagon, the five-folded symmetry of the pentagon within a circle. That then you'll find 12 of those pentagons that you can tile together and wrap into a dodecahedron. And then none of that could have happened if you hadn't first done the exploration of the golden section first. And he takes you through exactly how that works, and makes you discover it yourself. And then when you do that, then you can discover why the icosahedron, which has 12 vertices and 20 sides, versus the dodecahedron that has 12 faces and 20 vertices, they're nested into each other in a very lawful way. One just has triangle faces, the other pentagon faces, but they're nested in. And within that, you could then create the tetrahedron that has 4 triangular faces of the same sides. Within that, you could place a cube and an octahedron that are inverses of each other. They're like sisters. But that when you nest them all together in a lawful way, proportions emerge that Kepler proves are necessary to understand the tempering of the planets in the solar system. They're necessary. You have to do that. And he goes through this beautiful book. So for people who took the time to experience that set of discoveries, he takes you through in a very Platonic way. He's taking you through his errors, like Plato's taking you through all of the errors of the false hypotheses, where they break down. That's the beauty of the dialogues. He doesn't give you ever a crystallized answer. He gives you more questions than you started with.
Right.
That's the thing. Yeah. So it creates a space for your mind to learn the art of posing potent questions.
Challenging you, not dictating to you.
Yeah. So you can never take anything Plato is saying literally. And you just can't. You could do that for Aristotle, because Aristotle says there is no such thing as ambiguity that can be truthful. Whereas Plato, it's all about just simply learning how to become self-aware of what you don't know. So he'll trip you up. He'll put jokes in. He'll by design, because he cares about the mind, and he'll have you start with good hypotheses, like what is justice? Sounds good in the Republic, but then all of a sudden, because of certain unexamined axioms that you permitted into your system that maybe did not differentiate human beings from guard dogs, that you wanted to breed to make better guardians, all of a sudden you're in eugenics, dystopic, fascist hellhole, and you're like, how the hell did that happen? And it's part of the challenge that he's throwing at the students, which Kepler is also doing. And so for Max Planck and others who have that method, they've drawn from that well, they make discoveries. God's creation resonates with their inquiring minds and passion much more effectively. And that translates into society's ability through their discoveries, their eurekas, to have a greater power and dominion over nature, to be fruitful and to multiply and to replenish the earth, and to have more people at a higher quality of life without any intrinsic absolute boundary. The boundary conditions exist, but they're all relative to whether we do or do not make those discoveries, and whether we tolerate or don't tolerate the oligarchical principle from shaping the limits of what we think of as our capacities. So, whether holographic universe or any of this stuff, if it's premised on false axioms, or like standard model Copenhagen school, Big Bang cosmology, or any of that, you could generally throw it out the window. It's trash. It's just nothing. And that can be proven to be so, because there is beautiful minds who have made penetrating discoveries into plasma, into better explanations of the cause of redshift that have nothing to do with the Big Bang or the Doppler effect, but that you don't want to. The redshift exists in various galaxies. Blue shifts exist in other galaxies, but it doesn't mean that the galaxies are moving away from a center point that blew up 13.7 billion years ago, before which there was nothing, and that everything came out of nothing, because nothing which again, they always try to get the mind to accept that core irrationalism, that
some sort of paradox that freezes your mind, and then from there, you're looking for a resolution because something doesn't make sense, and then they can just start piling on rules. And that's kind of how I see it. It's like I look for paradoxes when people are talking about things, and just like this holographic universe book, when I was reading it, I don't think it's like a big influential book, but it feels like that is where a lot of the truther movement is being sucked into. They're somehow being drawn into this idea that that everything is fake and everything is imaginary, and therefore, if you're not a positive thinker, which is why it's interesting to hear you, because you're being optimistic, but it doesn't sound like you are taking the easy shortcut of saying, oh, okay, everything's fake. Well, then let's all just get onto this frequency, and the whatever the Hertz frequency is that they say, and therefore that's the God frequency, and then everything becomes good. And if you're a cynical person, you make the world a worse place by simply existing and by having negative thoughts or something. Like that's where he goes, and but he'll draw in material from absolutely anywhere. He's very syncretist. How do you say that? Syncretic.
Yeah.
And he's trying to unite all faiths and religions and stuff by saying that essentially, this is the Aquarian, sort of discovery that everything is shared mysticism, and so
the Christ consciousness, and
everyone has the Christ consciousness. But he'll pull in stuff like, he has examples that I talk about of, like, reincarnation, and how the terrible events that happen in a life, like a woman gets raped, she must have programmed that herself, but in between her lives, during her reincarnation process. And while she was disembodied, she said, what, in my next life, I need to experience this, because that'll teach me X, Y, and Z narrative that I didn't learn in my last one. And so actually, it's nobody's fault that she got raped. She kind of did it to herself. Like, this is the absolute satanic, perverse logic that can come out of this idea that, it's like Oprah's, The Secret or whatever, like this idea that
Eckhart Tolle,
that if you, her famous quote that they must have, or the guest that she had on, I think it was actually the one that said it, but that, the people who died in a huge tsunami must have been having tsunami-like thoughts and manifested the tsunami that came and killed, thousands of people and stuff. That
Disgusting, man. It's so fucking, sorry for the language, but it's so disgusting. And I had that when I was telling you that I was going down my new age bad place when I was
Mm.
trying to figure this stuff out 20 years plus ago. That was one of the places yeah, like when I didn't want to get involved in the Schiller Institute stuff, one of the fights that I had with a young girl who was more moral than me at that time by far was over Africa, which I couldn't deny that Africa was being mutilated by design and kept, dark in a dark age in our modern age, by design. But yet I remember having this absurd uh not even argument, but I was justifying my complacency to not do anything because it made me feel angry, and that would put out bad resonances that would only help the oligarchy. Whereas if I felt happy, then I wouldn't. And so the idea of getting uncomfortable made me unhappy, and I got myself into a weird mental place where that's the cause of why Africa's got these problems, because people are too unhappy. And I remember
ignorance
that.
is bliss. I mean, that's
Yeah. And, she threw it at me, like, she was like, don't you think that you fighting to end imperialism in Africa might actually do more good than you just feeling good in your house? And I was like, I was at least honest enough to say that I agree. So, but
mm,
still, like, the fact that that was inside of me, it horrified me more and more later on. It still horrifies me now. And hearing you speak right now is a reminder that, yeah, that's a big thing in the new age, even intelligent conspiracy minded people. The thing that tempers their values is crap like that David Icke promotes that stuff too, that we have to put up our love field or love frequencies and defeat the
mm.
big bad interdimensional lizards through our love, because they feed off of our fear. That's why they want us to feel miserable.
Which is the most ironic thing ever coming from him, the most hypocritical thing coming from him, because he is the most fear-mongering, cynical, human-hating person that you could ever listen to. That there's just the unwashed masses that cannot handle the truth, and they need to be essentially eliminated. That there's going to be a big shakeup. That I've talked about Alex Jones and David Icke essentially
Mm,
repeating the same thing as the Klaus Schwab, the Great Reset. That there's there and Alice Bailey, that there's just this coming point where there's going to be a kill off of humanity, and not everyone can make it to the next phase of that is the Aquarian age. I mean, that's the idea of the age of Aquarius, is that there's this new age that not everyone is prepared for, this huge leap in human consciousness and evolution, and who's going to be able to be qualified to make it. It's going to be these enlightened, initiated people. Alex Jones is essentially saying that, and David Icke say the same thing, just from the opposite point of view, that there's going to be that, you need to prepare yourself for this purge. They might frame it as a good thing, that there's a
yeah,
collapse and we're going to get rid of these old systems, and the idea of the Great Reset and the Great Awakening being the same thing,
yeah.
two sides of the same coin, is something that I
And
try to talk about a lot.
no, it's me too. And I mean, there's a number of influencers that have just been spread into the alternative media zeitgeist and podcast realm and Substack realm, like the escape key thing that's nudging people towards Kabbalah and the idea of, having AI sustainable development goals be the great outcome after they reveal all of these bad things in their very meticulous Substacks. They're nudging people ultimately towards total occultism and the acceptance of world government enslavement at the end of the day. There's EM Burlingame as well, is just kind of just been pummeled out there everywhere, promoting pretty much the same thing: the necessity of accelerating a great reset, the necessity of killing off or accepting that big, useless eaters have to die en masse, that we have to be ready to kill and be killed to
Mhm.
save our tribe and to fend off the immigrant invaders that want to colonize us, and restore hereditary, princes that will be managing the new system of feudal dukedoms in our new reset world, that we should be servants of. So there's like all of these creatures. Professor Zhang is another figure who's just been kind of put out there as this charismatic, very intelligent, Chinese guy from Toronto, who's just everywhere all of a sudden. And if you like listen to what he's actually saying, there are some toxic Trojan horses that would have you conclude that the nation state is the cause of all of our problems. So like they're exposing 95% of these
Sure,
very,
yeah.
very useful things that are very attractive to, conspiracy minded people. But then look at what they're actually slipping into the radar. Where are and there's little occult nudgings towards studying various traditionalist Rene Guénon occultists that are supposed to have had all of this like secret special wisdom that you can also maybe have.
Mm-hmm.
Very theosophical. All of it is theosophical. But you picked up on that too, right? In your books and in your interviews, like the theosophists are just bloody everywhere, permeating everything, and their influence is mind blowing. What they've been able to come up with. It's
For me, that is the most tangible connection I can find between stuff like because the idea of the revenge of the mystery cults, that's the name of your book series. I'm thinking, are we actually arguing that that there is, like the Freemasons would have you believe, that there is an unbroken chain of secret masters who are from the time of the Temple of Solomon, they're manipulating everything. Like there's this very seductive conspiracy theory that there is just this master engineering secret society that contains its information all the way till today, and that the theosophists and stuff, they're like, they all want to claim this heritage and claim to have these deep roots that go back however far they want them to go back. And I'm very skeptical of that. But I do think that obviously stuff like the Renaissance and the rediscovery of all, the ancient Greco-Roman literature and stuff that came into Europe and stuff, of course, that revived, good and bad things. There's a Hellenism 2.0 happening where they suddenly discover the mystery schools, and they discover these wonderful, positive philosophies and all this kind of stuff. And for me, the theosophists are sort of the most concrete thing that I can point to, or that I can think of, with Alice Bailey and Marilyn Ferguson talking about, no, we are actually infiltrating real institutions and real organizations. We have a secret plan. I mean, they talk about it as an Aquarian conspiracy. That's Marilyn Ferguson's book. And it's like, we will get into these institutions, and essentially we will get to the point where we can collapse them and trigger the age of Aquarius. And that I can actually, I try to limit my imagination as to how, the lizard people and stuff, I don't want to hear anything about it. But a group of people who subscribe to this ideology, that get into institutions, control colleges, and basically steer things in a dysfunctional direction, because they know that if it's not sustainable, it can be collapsed, and they want to build from the ashes. They don't want to reform things slowly. I mean, the Fabians do. Fabian socialism, they wants to slowly transform things gradually, but I feel like this is a separate project to collapse things and create a something from chaos and ashes.
Yeah. Well, the Fabian society method is only gradualism until you strike. That's the turtle, I take a long time to strike, but when I do, I strike hard, is the little their symbol. So yeah,
so it's not a conflict. That's actually that is the same thing. I see.
Yeah, it's the same thing. And but it's the same thing too, that's why it's so valuable to like read like the early church fathers and some of the battles that were happening in the early days of the church, even like pre-Nicaea, during, a little bit after. And you start, the rich contour of struggle against the Gnostics it's the same thing. Like when you get a handle on like the Gnostic philosophies of the Basilides, of the Valentinius and the Marcions and the Manes, it is the Theosophists. Like that is their cosmology of the archons, of the emanations of the demiurge, or the emanations of the great Lucius oneness that transcends right and wrong, that is totally separated from the physical reality we live in. That's the cause of whatever it was, multiple sexualized archons hitting it off and generating this monstrosity of a fallen Sophia who gives rise to her own, has sex with herself and produces this demiurge character of Yaljba or whatever the name is. That then is the creator god of the Old Testament, says the Gnostics, that we have to purge ourselves of the evil that is in matter, that is like we are living in this hellish shackle of existence that we can only get out of if we use special ceremonial rituals that usually involve a lot of sex, drugs, and sacrifice.
Always altered states of consciousness. That's the universal.
Yeah, and then maybe, after you've gotten enough altered states and outer body experiences and you've merged, profane and sacred together enough times, maybe you can like become self-actualized and think that you're God, or at least one of your personalities, right? That gets turned on when it's useful. So it's the same brainwashing techniques that they just modify and adapt. But it's really not that creative. But you get it when you read like Saint Irenaeus of Lyons or Hippolytus, who are battling these heresies. And really, that's the Theosophists. They despise Saint Irenaeus. They despise Hippolytus. They despise Augustine, who's battling the Manichaeans and the Pelagians and the Donatists and he's doing a great job. Like they're all doing fantastic jobs of exposing how they're using tricks. How you can make it seem as though there's like lights and stars on the roof or the ceiling of a darkened room of a seance that you're trying to communicate or do to persuade a doofus that you're speaking to the angels or whatever. And second, third century, they're doing a lot of these same things that the spiritualists that are doing the ghost rappings in America or in England are doing the same bloody thing. So it's trickery, it's disgusting, and they got a nasty cosmology, a deep misanthropic hate of themselves and of humanity, and they're consistently bad. And we're just that's another thing too. We're just like consistently naive, like human beings. Like H.G. Wells had said, the greatest benefit that the oligarchy or that the British Empire has is people's unwillingness to think of evil. And I think the oligarchy kind of knows that we have a proclivity towards goodness, which they despise. They just think that that's why we're stupid, but they use it to their advantage because we project our own simplicity, and goodness, so-called, onto the external world. And we can't imagine how something so perverse and unnatural and evil could possibly exist, shaping our world. People can't even fathom it.
No, I've found that for myself. I mean, COVID did a lot to make people paranoid suddenly, but that's not the same as being rational investigators and that can actually break down problems into root causes or anything like that. It's just, that's where I wrote Fire in the Rabbit Hole. It was like, now we're here. Now everybody is going down rabbit holes and they don't know why or what they're getting into, and they're just following it. And to me, it just seemed like it was all leading to this Aquarian Age type of, merger of all conspiracy theories ultimately leading to this need for a collapse and a purge, and then something manifests. Like it's a very vague, ominous thing that is happening in the subculture that I used to try to get people to care about anything, journalism, any conspiracy theories, anything, but nobody wanted to hear it. They're in full denial. Now they're ahead of me. They think they're ahead of me. Oh yes, I know all about that. I know about how the Earth is flat. I know that I know about Vril, and it's like I talked to you 6 years ago, and you wouldn't even listen to about building number 7, and now you're telling me about Vril, and you're full on like.
Dude, man, that's funny because I was just having not that long ago a discussion with somebody in my family who they didn't want to hear it. When I was doing the stuff they didn't want to hear it years ago. And now they're like full hog. They were just telling me about their view that Abraham Lincoln is still alive in underground tunnels. Anyway,
that's where it is. Yeah. I think I've taken up enough of your time though, and I think for me this was great. I got everything I wanted to orient myself a little bit more to be able to. Now I feel like now if I read your books, I'm going to be able to just run and actually understand your greater philosophy more. There's all sorts of other stuff that I could get into in terms of, if you wanted to discuss the idea of prophecy and how anything on the spiritual side of that, my views on that, I would like to discuss it. But
Well, oh yeah, let's maybe reschedule another chat. Because yeah, I didn't get to ask you as well about the newest post that you just had. You and I are both looking at the Gaia cult's Jesuitical infiltration and undermining of Christianity, and you put out a new post going through a
right,
sort of
the COP
reassessment.
26
Yeah, yeah.
takeover. I see as a takeover of religions to induct them into the green agenda and the death cult that represents.
Yeah, we could definitely, unpack that and your work on that and share. So yeah, maybe let's do this again in a couple of weeks and just follow it up.
Okay. Well, I mean, tell people. Here's what I would like you to tell, because I don't, instead of just plugging something. Where do people start with your work? What is a good, like, shallow end of the pool to get into? Because I see you've got documentaries. I feel like that would probably be
Yeah,
the most accessible way to get a
yeah,
lot of good
right.
information.
Yeah. So most of my documentaries that Cynthia and I have made over the past 3 years with principally our good friend Jason Dahl, who lives up in the Yukon, and great filmmaker, and now our new our old friend David, who's become a new filmmaker as well. We've been collaborating with him too. But they're mostly all available for free. And if people go to, I'll send you the link to put maybe the description box or
Mhm.
something, and they can go to the description box and maybe just binge on those documentaries, take some notes. Got stuff on the CIA and occult operations behind the UFO operation and disclosure projects. We've got stuff on Eurasia, deep state politics in China and Russia. We got stuff on deep history of secret societies, you name it. So a lot, like, you could binge on that for a few days as an entry point, I guess, to build up a bit of a scaffold of like where we stand. And then from there, if people have watched this whole chat, we've had now for an hour and 46 minutes, they were probably equipped to, I think, do well with my
Mhm.
book that came out right before the Mystery Cults trilogy, which is called Science Unshackled: Restoring Causality to a World in Chaos, where
Okay.
it's like 13 chapters, and I tried to sort of flesh out a lot of the content that you and I just discussed today. A lot of it's fleshed out in much thorough detail in that place, and
Sure.
that's available on CanadianPatriot.org with my videos, or I'll send you a link to that too, so people could also access that book if they want to.
Okay. Good. That's excellent. Stick around, and we'll talk a little bit more after the show. And for now, let's say that's it, and then we can reschedule. I'd look forward to that.
Okay, yeah, me too.
All right.